Purposely. Your life, God's purpose. Listen at purposely.com.
Hey friend, I'm Julie Lyles-Carr. This is the AllMomDoes podcast, part of the Purposely Podcast Network. You have arrived at episode 2. We are doing a two-parter on a particular issue in marriage. Now, this is your friendly, put on those headphones little, alert that this is definitely a conversation in which we are pretty open and pretty blunt about some specific things within marriage. So be sure and put those headphones on. But after you have those headphones on, I want to make sure that you listen to part 1. We're talking to Jay Parker. She is a therapist. She does all kinds of great work with marriage and intimacy. So be sure that you go and listen to part 1 if you haven't heard that yet. Then come back here and listen to part 2, where Jay Parker and I talk even more about a really fascinating thing that I was seeing come up in ministry, something that she's seen a lot in her practice, and that is the issue of the higher desire wife. So welcome to part 2 and welcome back with my guest, Jay Parker. I find that in my own marriage, I tend to be more of a shoulder-to-shoulder person. I'm a project person. Work on a project with me. I feel really connected. And I know I'm a little different than some gals in that way. But my husband and I have definitely found whatever the topic is that we're needing to discuss, when we go on a hike, we do a really good, stomp it out kind of hike, we get so much further in our communication doing that because it's allowing some of the nerves or whatever that are happening to be processed through the body in a way in which you're hiking up this way and you're going down that trail, that shoulder to shoulder thing. And that not being face to face and constantly analyzing each other's micro expressions. As much as we want this to be a connective time, sometimes we can be over guessing and over speculating what's going on with our spouse when we are looking at each other face to face. So we've found this idea of being on a walk, being on a hike, whatever, really, really helpful in our conversations.
And it's also good to remember this is unlikely to be one conversation.
Right.
It can be several. And if your husband gets flooded, if this is hard for him, you can always say, it looks like maybe we need to take a break and let's come back to this.
Right.
And I would say my final tip on this for now would be to remain curious. I talked about being a student of your spouse, but all too often when we want to have a talk, hey, honey, let's have a talk. What we really mean is I want to spill all my emotions and complaints on you. And then I want you to solve them.
Yeah.
And I'm saying this, I'm so guilty of this at times, but you're going to get a lot better if you say, look, I notice this is happening. I feel like this, but I need to ask you some questions. So what do you think is going on? Would you like to have sex more often? What would make it easier for you to engage? What do you think is going on with your level of desire?
And Jay, if somebody comes to that place and they have navigated, they've created a safe space for they and their spouse to talk, there is agreement. Yeah, we seem to be a bit mismatched. But then the listener may be thinking, yeah, but I think I'm about to find out that my husband is using a lot of porn. At what point in that conversation do you maybe need to think about, we probably need to get in front of a third party to navigate this, or we need some additional help to get in front of this? Tell me where that threshold is, because I know sometimes, particularly when it comes to intimacy, particularly if a couple is bound together in faith, that can feel really uncomfortable to get in front of a third person to talk about sex. But if you have something like a pornography usage come into play, or a wife's use of, book talk, smut kind of stuff coming into play in some of this, I mean, where is that line where it's time to bring in the professionals?
That's a difficult question, I think, to answer because it is a little bit couple and situation dependent. So for some people, I think if you anticipate this is what it's going to be, you want to go ahead and say, hey, I have something I want to talk out. Can I schedule a session with a marriage counselor? Would you come with me? And then you could say, hey, I'm worried that maybe you're using porn again or whatever it is with that third person. Other people, I think they're going to open up a conversation and not know that's coming. And then it's going to get dropped. And it's probably won't get dropped in the first conversation. Yeah. Very often these confessions of something else is going on take a few times for the person to really feel safe enough to say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and come clean. But when that happens, it is true. The knowledge is just that revelation moment is devastating, because it is a sexual betrayal. God intended for us to devote all of our sexual energy, all of our focus to our spouse. It really should be, I only have eyes for you. And so when you've been looking at all that stuff and you've been putting your sexual energy on other people, even if they're fantasy, then it's kind of a betrayal of what you were supposed to be doing and the way you were supposed to be holding your spouse in honor. So then you have to kind of sort out the two different things. And really, in all of these cases, even if it's something as simple as stress or low T or whatever, in all of these situations, you've kind of got dual things happening. You have the person who's got a problem or issue to be resolved needs to deal with it themselves. And then the other person needs to get the support they need to be able to support their spouse in this. So sometimes we miss one side of that. We'll say, oh, well, he needs to get clean of porn. And we don't tend to the fact that it's quite reasonable for her to be very angry, very upset, grieve, and to go through her thing. And for a lot of people who do have a confession, by the time they say it, they feel this relief. They're like, oh, I got that off and now I'm good. Well, it's only just begun.
A whole
for the
new
spouse
world.
who just heard it.
Right, for the spouse. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that that's something that has to be processed because, yeah, it's, you may have suspected something's going on. You may have thought that there's something behind the scenes that's happening, that there seems to be this mismatch. And to be kind to yourself, that you are going to be going on a journey, if it turns out to be one of these things, that you're going to get back to the mismatch, but you're going to have something that has to be dealt with first before you can actually then figure out how to get more in step with your sexual partner.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we try to rush the process. And I think sometimes the advice that has been given in Christian circles attempts to rush the process on all these kinds of things, that what we want to say to lower desire spouses is, well, you just need to start having more sex, and that more frequent sex will just kind of resolve things. But what I've also noticed is that most higher desire spouses, they don't just want more sex. They're not just there to get a physical release. What they really want is they want intimacy. And so we want to make love to someone who wants to be there, who's also eager to make love to us. And in fact, I say kind of the banner verse for higher desire wives is, I belong to my beloved and his desire is for me, which I think is Song of Songs 7:10. But this idea that he desires me the way I desire him.
Right. That there's a match there, that we equally want each other, whatever that ends up looking like in the bedroom.
Yeah. And I think actually that's interesting you use the word equally, because I sometimes say that sexual intimacy should be mutually desired and mutually satisfying, but it's not necessarily going to be equally desired. We are going to be mutually, we should both want each other. We should both be getting something out of it. But just like I like to converse more than my husband does, but that doesn't mean that when he's talking to me, I feel like he's been forced into that conversation.
Right, right. That there's a symbiosis there, that we are wanting time together. And for one of us, that might mean more of this. And for another, it might mean more of that. But the idea is that we want time together and connection. Yeah.
And all of these places, we want to, as much as possible, close the gap. But we know there are still going to be differences. And that's okay, because when we've closed the gap and we're basically on the same page for what we're prioritizing, and we feel loved. Right. We feel good.
Jay, what have you seen in terms of fertility and the role that it plays in this topic of a higher desire wife? I ask this because I have known guys in my life who, in the effort to try to get pregnant and having challenges come along the way in their fertility journey, guys will say, I'm starting to feel like this is a job. It's like, we're on this schedule and there are shots and there's this and there's that. And it has nothing to do with desire anymore. It just has to do with trying to get this job done. And it can really cast a pale over the entire sexual relationship. And sometimes that happens for women. Sometimes it happens for men. What are you seeing in your work when it comes to this, particularly as we see more and more couples struggling to conceive, and then they have to make their sexual life sort of this open book to specialists and interventions and all kinds of things.
Well, anytime sex starts to feel rote and it's, we feel like it loses a little bit of its passion. And the other thing is nobody wants to go into sex feeling like they're being used by any means.
Right.
And I think when you're going through this long fertility journey, then you can start feeling like I'm not here as a lover. I'm here as a baby maker. And I'm being used to get to this end goal. And I think a lot of it's just going to be about reframing that. And so you mentioned earlier about putting sex on the calendar at times in your life. And I'm a proponent of scheduling sex. That can look all kinds of different ways, but putting it on the calendar is a good idea. And it's going to be the same thing when you're trying to conceive, is you're going to want to quote unquote put it on the calendar. But we need to remember that's what we used to do. We were dating. We used to put it on the calendar, or we used to say, hey, let's go out tonight. And so we would have a block of time. But we brought ourselves and said, okay, now that we're here, how can we connect? And what kind of fun can we have? And I think we need to reframe that of, yes, we're here to make a baby, to have sex, to whatever, but this is actually not just our conception moment. This is a sex date. Mm-hmm. And how do I get to date? How do I get to woo and romance and whatever within this overall goal that we have?
Thank you to our sponsor, George Fox University. George Fox University is unique. It is a Christ-centered, student-focused university where your student is going to be appreciated for the individual they are, the learning style, and the goals that they have, while also keeping focus on their relationship with Christ. I want you to go check it out at georgefox.edu. Again, that's georgefox.edu. Thanks so much for being our sponsor, George Fox. What do you say to the wife who says, listen, Jay, I invited my husband to go on the walk. We did the shoulder to shoulder thing. We put mulch in the yard. I tried to bring this up. I'm really struggling. He does not want to talk about it. He doesn't want to hear about it. I'm committed to my marriage. I love God, but I don't know what to do. I'm so frustrated. What do you say to that gal who is sitting in that position?
Well, the first thing I want to say is you're not alone. There are other wives who've been through what you've been through. They know what it feels like. They know the heartache of rejection. They know how lonely that moment is. So in fact, I have a Higher Desire wife community that we support one another. And some people have made great improvements in the sexual intimacy in their marriage, and some people have not yet. But there is some beauty in the community in knowing you're not alone. The other thing is that your husband may actually just be overwhelmed for a short time, in which case you may need to say, okay, I have not stopped caring about this topic, and I continue to want better for our sexual intimacy, but I can tell that this is not going anywhere right now. So I'm going to stop talking about it for a little bit, and I want us to come back around to it later. And then give it a breather and come back around at another time. And in the meantime, I give tips on what you can do to not seduce your husband. All too often we have this idea spread out there, usually by people who have had the other idea of a higher desire husband and a lower desire wife. And they think, well, all the wife really needs to do is put on a really fun nightie and go in there and seduce him. And that's not usually what the issue is. And so it doesn't really work. And it makes you feel worse because now you've really put yourself out there. Yeah. But the things you can do are to, build your friendship and your companionship. Try to be more affectionate. Pursue some times of flirting and so forth. And also, one of the things that made a huge difference for me is I flipped the switch from initiation to availability. And what I mean by that is, instead of pitching, hey, want to have sex, and getting no, not because he was rejecting me, but because in the moment it wasn't a good time or whatever, I would start saying things like, hey, I would really like to have sex tonight. So I'm going to go in the bedroom. I'm going to be there doing this and that. If you're interested, why don't you come join me in the next few minutes? And so the invitation was there, but I didn't set up a big expectation. And then he didn't feel the pressure either. And I actually got more yeses that way to say, hey, I'm interested. I would love to do this. Or even to say, is there anything I could do to help you get in the mood?
Right, right. And I think that invitation versus expectation, that's a really great way of looking at that. Jay, before we started recording, you and I talked about what verbiage we were going to use in this interview and what we felt like. And I told you from my heart, I think we should be using all the medical terms and all the stuff and really be talking about this. And yet I also want to be sensitive to those who are still struggling with having sex conversations and using particular terms and all that kind of stuff. And I think for a lot of us, in our faith communities, whether we were raised in faith, whether we came to faith later in life, whether we feel like we made a lot of mistakes with our sexuality, whether we feel like we came into marriage pretty naive and pretty virginal, however we arrived where we are today, I still feel like the church is having a hard time having these conversations and having them in a very realistic manner. What are some things that you think would be really helpful in our faith communities, particularly for higher desire wives, to begin to break down some of these barriers that are happening? Because it's hard to find resources, I think, from a faith-based perspective that really take into account differences in sex drive, differences in experiences, coming to marriage, all of those things. And we still don't feel like we've hit our stride. I know when I was in vocational ministry, I was just hungry for resources that would really address exactly where women really live today. And there was an absence of a lot of that. Thankfully, you have phenomenal resources along these lines. What do you think that our faith communities, leadership, all the rest need to be doing to be having real conversations and serving higher desire wives well?
Well, I think one of the problems is we often have this idea that the pastor is the one who's supposed to do this. He's the one who covers issues. And so if something's going to be covered, it's going to be Sunday morning. And we all know Sunday morning sermons are not a time when most members are going to welcome the word sex.
Yeah.
We have our kids beside us or this or that. Also, we're expecting our pastors maybe to do more than he should. I have been doing this for 14 years. I have learned so much. Yeah. I mean, I came with some knowledge, but I have learned so much. And many pastors are not going to have that knowledge in this specific niche area. They're going to know some overall things. Right. So you might want to look for some of those resources that you can bring in. And sometimes the subject is easier to bring up on marriage retreats or at a women's day conference or an evening meeting, a small group. I also go in and I speak to groups of MomCo, used to be Mothers of Preschoolers, MomCo. And so I go in and speak to them about sex. They're in the thick of it right now, raising these kids. And how do you continue to have great sexual intimacy when you have kids and either a husband who feels like he's really missing sex, or you and your husband both missing sex because when do you have time, or a wife who's wanting it more. And so I speak to those situations, and there are people out there who do this. There are resources, and you can bring in those things. So if you don't feel fully equipped to do it, there are some things out there you could do. You can go through a book in your small group. You can start those conversations. Also, if you're the higher desire wife, it can be awkward to be the first one to say it. Right. If you're in a group and there is a bunch of women and they're talking about, oh, my husband wants sex all the time and this and that.
He's chasing me. Yeah.
And first of all, that saddens you because you're thinking to yourself, well, wouldn't that be nice? And these women are complaining about it. But which, I mean, look, I get it too. So if you're a lower desire wife out there, I totally get that side too. But I think it's reasonable to say, you know what? Actually, it's up to 25% of marriages or more that have a wife who desires sex more than her husband. Mm-hmm. And you can just drop that right there and see what happens. And then you can follow up and say, I've been through some of that. And maybe not that time somebody will say me too, but I have found that I've done that. And then like after everyone's kind of broken up, someone will come to me that was in the group and the woman will privately say to me, that's my situation too.
Yeah.
And now you've found your peeps.
Right. Now you found somebody that you can talk with and help each other and help equip each other. Looking back at everything that you now know from life experience, from professional training, from all of the people you've talked to, all the rest, and being a follower of Christ and wanting to provide great godly solutions for marriages to walk forward in their most robust spirituality and intimacy, how would you reframe today the way that you learned about sex, the way that you experienced your journey? How would you reframe that? Because I think sometimes in these conversations, whether we intend for it to be there or not, we're dragging some baggage with us. And whether that is, well, I always thought that husbands were supposed to be the initiators or the ones who were wanting it more, or if it is, well, I'm worried about this, or I want to try that, or I've learned about this and I didn't even know that was a possibility. And now is that okay in a Christian marriage? There are so many topics that are still sitting there that a lot of us drag with us into our relationship. So, what would you say to yourself today if you were looking back and you were constructing those early conversations about sex to be able to come into it in the most healthful way?
Ah, there's so much I wish was done differently. And I bet a lot of people out there just heard that sentence and thought to themselves, me too.
Me too. Yeah.
I did not grow up with purity culture, but a lot of the same messages were just kind of there. And so when I was growing up and I became a teenager, I did realize, attention from a guy felt great. Kissing a guy awakened some parts of me that felt really good and wanted more. And what I was learning from church was essentially that you weren't supposed to have sex before marriage and that he was going to want sex more than she does. And so she has to be the one responsible to stop it.
You're the gatekeeper. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I felt like my desire was not as important as his desire, and which I don't think is true now. So I think I would be telling young women that, first of all women, you're a sexual being. God created you with the parts, the capacity for arousal, for pleasure, for climax, all these things. So God made you a sexual being, and that is a good thing. So God's created male and female, and he said it's very good. And so our sexuality is a good thing. Now, the question is, how are we going to steward that? And each person is responsible for themselves, but that means I need to figure out how I'm going to steward it. And all too often, what we decided is that we were going to fight against our sexuality.
Right.
So we were going to take on this battle. And so one of us was going to win. Either the sexual desire was going to win, or we were going to win. And one of them was going to be defeated. And in my case, I actually did not defeat that. My desire kind of kept coming up I've described it as like a balloon popping out of the water. It just kind of kept coming back. So my efforts to push it down didn't work. And another message I got back then was, if that's you, and if you've really messed up, you're kind of tainted and it's never going to be right again.
Mm-hmm.
And what I would tell young me is no. No one is pure of their own self. We are all purified by Christ. All of us have sins that are scarlet, whatever that looks like. It is God who makes us white as snow. And yes, of course, I want to say, wait until marriage, wait until the right context. Of course, I want us to pursue the best options, but God is a God of redemption. So if you messed up, that's okay. That's why God is here. That's why Jesus did what he did. And so I would want to tell young me, listen, your sexuality is a good part of you. We need to figure out some ways to strategize this. Then you need to know if you mess up, there'll be redemption. And then the final piece, I think, is just casting a vision for what great sex is, because there's been this focus for so long on sexual sin. When we talk about sex, we start talking about sexual sin.
Yeah.
And look, we need to talk about it. God talked about it, but God also cast this vision of beautiful sexual intimacy in a marriage. We have an entire book in the Bible about that. Song of Solomon, whether you believe it is an allegory or ancient love poetry, either way, the inclusion of it is God saying, hey, this intimate marital relationship is a good thing. And marriage is where sex goes to thrive. Too often we've believed that marriage is can't get out. Marriage is where sex goes to die.
Yeah.
No, it's where it goes to thrive.
Right.
And so if I knew what was out there waiting for me, I think it really does make it easier to steward that sexuality well.
It is interesting how we have built a culture and a faith culture around trying to squelch this instead of the appropriate celebration of it. And I know we try to, in retrospect, go, no, we think it's amazing and that's really how it should be. And here's this and here's that. But the messaging leading up to it often doesn't match what we then say in post-production, if you will. And
Right.
I've known people in my life who they thought they were marrying someone of character who seemed to have no desire for them in those courting stages. Like, what a gentleman, or what a fine young lady. Like, this does not seem to be a temptation at all for them. They must be so noble. And then the expectation that it was all going to switch the minute they got down the aisle, and how there was a mismatch actually at the very start because they weren't suited to one another in that way. However that happened, wherever that came from. And so I've always been concerned at times when we try to talk away the importance of whatever you want to call it. Paul called it the burn, if you want to call it chemistry,
Right.
if you want to call it temptation, but that connection that should be there that is so celebrated in Song of Solomon. I mean, that is a spicy book. We did not create spice in and of our own. That is a spicy book that stands alone. So how do we get to that place appropriately as women today, where we're not gaslighting ourselves about our desire, we're not underestimating, we're not overestimating? What do you reflect on as an important precept for living in the way God intends for you to be a fully sexual being in the way in which He created you?
I think it really does, for me, start with defining yourself according to God and what is good about you, and living out our Christ-like virtues in the bedroom. And so I think you're going to know that your desire is in a healthy place when it reads a lot like 1 Corinthians 13, 4-7. When you say, you know what, my sexual approach to my husband is kind, it's patient, it's not self-seeking, it honors him, it does these things, then I think that's all good. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not going to still want sex more than he does. You might, or he might want it more than you. But I think when it is coming out of a place of genuine love, then you're also honoring that. And also understanding God's love for you and the body that you have. I mean, I also love Psalm 139, where it talks about how God knit you together in his womb. And that means he knit everything, even the nice little lady parts down below. Those were knitted by God too. And it is honoring God to honor that about your body.
That's such a great way of seeing that. You have been so generous with your time, Jay Parker. I am
My
so
pleasure.
grateful for you. The book is called The Higher Desire: Wife, Understanding and Help for Christian Women Navigating Mismatched Sex Drives. And check this out. If you've been listening going, well, I'm not the higher desire wife, no worries. Jay's got all kinds of other great resources for you. So be sure and go check that out. Jay, where's the best place for the listener to go to find all of your great resources?
The best place is my website, which is hotholyhumorous.com. And that is what I named my ministry, because I felt like sex and marriage should be hot, it should be holy, and it is sometimes humorous.
Yeah.
So, and I would also say I love your podcast. I also have a co-hosted podcast with two other lovely ladies that, shout out to Chris and Bonnie, who are marvelous. And that is called Sex Chat for Christian Wives. And you can find that at For Christian Wives, FORChristianwives.com.
Excellent. Well, Jay, thank you so much again for your time, your expertise, your heart today. I really appreciate it. It's just such a delight to get to connect with you.
Well, thank you so much, Julie, for having me on.
Absolutely. Okay, listener, I say this every week, but seriously, go to the show notes. Rebecca's going to have all of these links and everywhere that you can go and find all of Jay Parker's great content, all kinds of questions answered, tips, ideas, and frank talk. You're going to find it. So be sure and check that out. And then AllMomDoes.com, AllMomDoes on the socials, and all of that great stuff. Great community there with a whole bunch of resources for you to consider when it comes to raising kids and marriage and your spiritual walk, all the stuff. I love it too when I hear from you. I'm pretty much on Instagram the most. So check me out there, Julie Lyles Carr. I love when you DM me questions, topics, guests that you would love to see. That really helps us curate what is going to really intersect and talk to you right where you're at, the season of life you're in, the things, the challenges you're facing, all of it. We love it when we hear from you. So I would love to know what's on your heart. And I will see you next time on the All Mom Does podcast.